Good evening. Welcome, everyone. My name is Yevgena Lazic, and I am the Associate Director of the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to a very special event this evening. It is our distinct pleasure to welcome tonight Dr. Nune Malikian, who has authored a book about Soviet Armenian composer Arno Babajanian, entitled The Unsung Maestro of Soviet Armenia. And I also wanted to acknowledge the Armenian Students Association here at Stanford that has been instrumental in helping this event come together, and it's very nice to see all of you today. So this is the first comprehensive English language biography of one of the most notable figures of the Soviet period. And it makes his life and his work accessible to audiences in the West. Dr. Malikian also teaches music at Yeshiva University in New York, and she received her PhD from McGill University in Montreal, where with a dissertation on Mr. Babajanian. And in addition to being a scholar and an educator, she is an emerging artist on the international stage, already quite decorated with over 18 awards, and is the only Armenian female violinist to have debuted at Carnegie Hall Stern with the symphony. She was born in Siberia and immigrated to Canada in her teens to pursue her master's degree at the University of Montreal. And this special book presentation is going to be accompanied thus, fittingly, by a musical performance as well. Dr. Malikian will be accompanied on piano by Mariam Abgarian, who is an accomplished musician in her own right, who is based here in San Francisco, but who has toured extensively around the world as well. So please join me in welcoming our very special guests.
much for being here. Do you hear me well?
Yes.
Great. It is such an enormous honor and pleasure to be here, to see so many of you coming, and we are of course extending our utmost gratitude to Professor Yelena for organizing this. What you have just heard is a scherzo from Sonata F.A.E. that's written by 3 different composers, and this particular movement is a scherzo, which translates from German as a joke, Scherz, by Johannes Brahms, who was one of the favorite composers of Babadjanyan, and that's why we decided to include that in the program. Following Brahms' scherzo, Mariam, who is my wonderful pianist tonight, and partner in crime, we'll be playing 2 pieces by Arno Babadjanyan proper. This will be impromptu and nocturne. piece was written by Arno Babajanyan, and if you're Armenian, you probably heard it many times in piano rendition because it was written for piano. However, it is one of my ever favorite pieces written by the composer, and I was wondering how come there is no violin interpretation, how come there is no violin arrangement. So this summer I actually commissioned a violin piano arrangement of this piece, and we recorded this at the Armenian Radio Archive recording studio, National Radio Archives recording studio, and this is a rendition, this is an arrangement by Andreasyan of The Elegy by Arno Babajanyan. part of the program, we could not miss this one. I actually call this piece a piece that is stronger than the Cold War, because when it was written, actually it became so massively and globally popular that even though it was coming from the Soviets, it won the hearts of the American audience. And two orchestras actually recorded that during the Cold War. And this is the Saber Dance by Aram Khachaturian, and he became so famous and so popular, so much so that in, I think, 1938, the Newsweek magazine offered and suggested to make him the person of the year. So for you, Aram Khachaturian, Saber Dance. So much. We'll get a little bit into the research part of my life and my recent. It's okay. And my recent activities for the past, I'd say, 13 years now. So the name of the book is Arno Babajanyan, the Armenian Beat in Soviet Time, and we decided to hold a presentation, the Asan Maestro. And it is a little play of words because he is mainly known as a composer of songs. So the name Asan is very appropriate and has a double entendre. So for those who knows, he is a phenomenon in the Soviet culture. Not only because he was a phenomenal pianist, but also because he was a composer of many faces, multifaceted. And he was an Armenian, a Soviet Armenian pianist, composer, and songwriter. He was born in 1921 in Yerevan, and I think it's quite interesting because that was the inception of the Soviet Armenia, that year that happened. He received his early music education in Yerevan, and his formation years, his more mature years, and academically speaking, he was mainly educated in Moscow. He was in Yerevan State Conservatory. He was a student and he graduated from the Yerevan State Conservatory, and concurrently he also studied at Moscow Conservatory, and he finished also the Gnesin Music College. And his piano abilities were so impressive that immediately after hearing him, the director of that school, Elena Gnesin, she let him skip 2 years of the program. That's how advanced he was as a pianist. And he is now, as I already mentioned, nowadays mostly known as a composer of schlagers, schlager music, the hits, you know, and this is something that I have been working on, trying to change a little bit the perception, not only within our diaspora, but also beyond. So, when we speak about the Soviets, we need to understand, you know, how bloody the history is. And of course, I'm not going to let you into the historical parcours. We don't have this time, but I wanted just to touch upon a few key important things that happened during that time that really shaped the paradigm of the Soviet time. So the Sovietization of the republics happened in 1921, and the republics such as Georgia, Azerbaijan, newly formed Armenia, who was already there, but really in between a lot of conflict between the Ottoman Empire and the Russians. All those republics were united into this Soviet Union. And that meant that the identity not necessarily lost, wasn't necessarily lost, but was definitely shifted and changed to fit into the global union agenda. So with the Soviets, the change came and new institutions were opened. A lot of wonderful institutions were actually open, and in my book I am trying to give it justice, and I am trying to be as unbiased as possible and say that even though, you know, it is a pretty bloody regime, but the Soviets gave a lot of academical institutions to a lot of these regions and a lot of these republics. So, for example, a laboratory of folk music by Romanos Medikyan was opened in that year. I actually just launched my book in December in Yerevan at Romanos Medikyan's college, one of the oldest colleges in Armenia, music colleges in Armenia. So a lot of those beautiful institutions were opened during that time, and Armenia, who was, as I already mentioned, politically very divided and really in a lot of concern about its survival, received an opportunity to have a proper academical music institutionalized curriculums. So of course with that came price that you were not necessarily as independent anymore. You had to fit into the proletariat, into the figure of the worker, and therefore the identity shifted. So to ensure that the republics and the republic composers and artists were complying with the state agenda, there were a few machines working in the union. So one of the biggest crises for following the state-aligned ideology in arts was Stalin Prize. I call it the Soviet Grammys. And interestingly, there were a few degrees to Stalin Prize, and somehow it just so happened that ethnic composers would always receive the second degree prizes, whereas the composers that were coming from Russia, they would notably receive the first degree prizes. So Stalin Prize was a way to encourage the composers of the union to write the music that would align with the government, and many amazing composers actually received Stalin Prize, including Khachaturian, including Shostakovich, but that was also a very, very powerful tool in controlling what exactly the composers were writing. There were also state-sponsored journals and newspapers, and they were commissions. A lot of commissions were, committees collected, and particularly in every republic, there were openings of the composers' union. We had writers' unions and we had composers' unions, and they were supervising whether or not what you're writing is not formalist, because God forbid you did, then your career would be completely ruined. So when it came to the republics, the Soviets really tried to enforce this notion of дружба народов, the friendship of nations, пролетарии всех стран, соединяйтесь, the workers of all the countries get together. So again, the composers were encouraged to write almost strictly folk music, and not necessarily thinking about avant-garde, and not necessarily thinking about what was going on in, New Viennese school, what was going on in America, what was going on, with Olivier Messiaen, for example. So they were really almost forced into tapping into their national origins. So folk music was also tailored to the state needs and attributes, meaning that, for example, the Christian countries such as Georgia and Armenia were stripped completely of the religious music because, as we all know, the Soviets were atheists. So when it comes to Babajanyan's place in the Soviets, it's a very interesting mixture because he was almost coming in second after Aram Khachaturian, whether he liked it or not. And he at first had a wonderful, absolutely amazing relationship with Aram Khachaturian, who was his mentor. And Aram Khachaturian was probably the biggest composer of the Soviets, the biggest Armenian composer of the time as well. And Aram Khachaturian personally contributed to Babajanyan's education and life. Therefore, he was his mentor, and he, very rightfully so, felt that he was his mentee. Here we see just a couple of pictures. These are all in my book. Unfortunately, I can't show them all, but here we see Vasily Silaitsev, who was one of the Soviet most prominent conductors, and here Babajanyan is performing as a pianist. We see Dmitry Shostakovich, whom I hope you maybe recognize, and we of course see Aram Khachaturian. This is actually the 50th anniversary of Aram Khachaturian's art, and that was the event they worked together in. So they were quite mature. Here we also see Mstislav Rostropovich. Babajanyan worked with Mstislav Rostropovich on his cello concerto, and I was just contacted recently because of the book that the cello concerto was just premiered in Huntington, California. So, so many years after Babajanyan's death, we still didn't have a US premiere of the cello concerto. That just happened a few days ago. On the right corner, we see Babajanyan in the place, surrounded by the group of composers. This is the place that's called Dilijan. It's a beautiful, we call it Armenian Switzerland. It's absolutely gorgeous. And right next to Babajanyan, in the center, we see Benjamin Britten, who also happens to be one of my ever favorite English composers, and overall amazing composer, who was absolutely mesmerized with Babajanyan's music. On the left corner, we see, of course, the Pulitzer winner, the writer, American writer of Armenian origin, William Saroyan. And here we see the Mighty Five. In Russia, we had the Mighty Five a few centuries ago, and there was the Armenian Mighty Five, and Babajanyan was surrounded by Mirzoyan, Tazaros Saryan, and Khudoyan. And actually, right next to him, on the left corner, Martin Vartazaryan, whom I actually had a pleasure of interviewing a few years ago, and I just saw him recently in December in Yerevan, who was a very long time collaborator of Babajanyan. So, having not received necessarily the encouragement from the Soviets to his piano career and to his classical compositions, Babajanyan slowly in the 60s turned towards the popular music, and he became one of the main, if not the main, popular music writers. We have to stop here for a second just to talk about his pianistic capabilities, because he was truly one of the main pianists of his time. And unfortunately, due to an illness that I describe in the book as well, he had to stop his career. He could not continue to the happiness of many Soviet pianists, because he was no longer a competition for them. But his pianistic approach was absolutely amazing, very innovative for the Soviet time, very rhapsodic-like. He liked a lot of Rachmaninoff works, he played a lot of Rachmaninoff. So he always included some Armenian folk elements into this very technically difficult, and I'm sure Mariam can attest to that, technically difficult pieces. He mainly, of course, composed for piano, especially when he was performing those pieces himself. He was considered to be the best interpreter of his piano works, and the rumor has it that when Babajanyan was playing a concert, people had to like call the police because there were so many people in the hall trying to listen to him, and it was such a rare occasion that people were fighting to get into the hall. But slowly his fame as a composer of popular music started spreading around, and not only union-wide but also across the globe. And here we see him in different settings. He is, of course, mainly known in the Soviets as a trio that we see on the right, you know, the color picture at the right corner. Upper corner, he was working with Muslim Magamayev, who is an Azeri singer, and Robert Rajestevsky, who was the writer. And unfortunately, due to the current and recent events between Armenia and Azerbaijan, the name of Babajanyan in all of the Muslim Magamayev's biographies got completely erased. So they no longer mention him. And when I was writing the book, my father came to me and he said, "Are you going to write about Muslim Magamayev?" And I said, "Yes, because he's the part of the history, and this was all Soviet, and we have to respect the history." And there was a very, very powerful trio back then. And together they won the state awards, they traveled the world, they were widely popular. To the point that the songs of Babajanyan were translated to more than 7 languages, to the point that Carlos Santana, who actually has a track that's called Europe, that took Babajanyan's melody as the theme of that song. Mireille Mathieu, for example, also sang one of the songs of Babajanyan, Je suis là, that's in Russian. That's in Russian, was sang by Anna German, another very well-known Soviet singer. So, because of his later transposing his talent, because of his later fame as a songwriter, Babajanyan was not considered a serious composer anymore in the Soviets, which he struggled with a lot because he was very, very skilled and extremely open-minded. He almost never wrote the music that would celebrate the workers, that would celebrate the Soviets. He always wrote the music that he felt was right, and he tried to never comply with the governmental agenda. And this is why he was not necessarily given the opportunities that he deserved as a classical composer. So he was not considered great because of the lack of symphonic works. Because in the States, they really loved when the composer were writing symphony works, big forms, choruses, brasses. So Babajanyan was not necessarily into that genre. And when there was a conversation about burying him at the Pantheon, where all the great Armenians are buried, the state actually refused and said, no, he's not considered a great composer, therefore he was not buried there. He is already said he was still widely recognized as a songwriter. And not a lot of people even know about his classical legacy, which is quite rich. And not only that, but also when it comes to materials about Babajanyan, we have virtually no comprehensive studies about his life and about his art. Babajanyan came into my life quite early. I was a student at the University of Montreal. I was 19, I moved by myself, I was very homesick, I didn't have any family around, and I proposed to play his piano trio for my chamber group lesson. And the public loved it so much, and the feedback was so generous and beautiful that we decided that I need to play that a little bit more. So I started organizing concerts of Armenian music. That was not necessarily financially lucrative, but I was very passionate about that. I really wanted to lecture, I really wanted to introduce the music of my culture to the Canadian audience, and it seemed to pick up very well. The project name was Hidden Treasure, and this is actually one of the very first concerts of mine. You can see I'm I look like a baby there. It's 2012. I rented the church. That was my collaborator, Michel Zankoga. And together we were playing the music of Armenian and Western composers, and this became a true passion of mine. And even though I played academical repertoire, the well-known, the well-established repertoire as a violinist, touring all over the world, there was always a part of my activities that were dedicated to the Armenian music and to promoting of the Armenian music. And this is the 2012, and this is the picture with Michel in 2019. We were finishing a Canada tour, and with this tour we actually went to the most isolated places of the country, to the places that you can't even fly in, that you have to get on the barge inside your car, and with population of 3,000 people. And in those places we were playing Armenian music, and in those places we were playing the music of Babajanyan. So in my almost 13 years right now of parkour, I've really tried to do my best to shed light on Babajanyan's music, on Babajanyan's figure abroad. The lacuna of comprehensive material in English was definitely one of the biggest obstacles for the generations, for young students to know about him, and for colleagues of mine to even learn his music. So I recorded his violin sonata, which is beautiful and was written in the style of Shostakovich and widely criticized by the composer's union. I recorded his violin sonata in 2017 for my Hidden Treasure debut album that actually created some traction within Canadian circles and beyond. I also made a first short documentary about him in English. For that reason, I went to Armenia. I've probably played his music all over the world, including Carnegie Hall on numerous occasions. I've given dozen lectures, both as a student, graduate student, and already as a professor myself. I wrote the first comprehensive dissertation about him, defending it at McGill University. And in my particular case, the reason why I went to do my doctorate was actually because I wanted to write about Babajanyan, not the other way around. I didn't get into my doctorate studies and thinking, okay, what am I going to write about? The whole incentive for me was to actually write something that would be academically viable. So that was the reason of my doctorate. And right now I work as a North American representative of the Arno Babajanyan International Foundation, also from 2019. So after the dissertation, I realized that there is a need for a place where people can come into and learn everything about Babajanyan, whether it is his personal life, whether it is his compositions, whether it is the list of all of the songs he wrote. And particularly working on the dissertation was very difficult because the material that is available about Babajanyan is very disorganized. So one source would say one date, another source would say completely different date. The premier city would be Moscow, another book is saying that the premier city was Yerevan. So the amount of meticulousness and patience it took to find the right facts about Babajanyan was truly overwhelming. But I'm very happy because right now I know that I was able to collect the information and have the first big comprehensive study, but not only about Babajanyan, but also about the brief, it's very briefly given history of Armenian culture, Armenian music. And since the name has the Soviet, the Soviet time, because we can't differentiate those two, it also gives a brief overview of the Soviet culture, Soviet thoughts of, on music. So you will find the realities of the Soviet artists in the book as well. Besides, you will also see the, as I already said, the most comprehensive list of his works, also the music analysis of a few of his works, and besides the biography itself. And I have obtained exclusive rights from the Babajanyan Foundation to use the pictures. So you will see over 100 pictures from the personal archive that were given to me by his son, Ara Babajanyan, and we worked very closely Here we actually have James Dick. I was hoping to perhaps see the video. I'm not sure whether or not it's working, but James Dick was actually a pianist. He was participant of the Tchaikovsky competition, and the compulsory piece that Babajanyan wrote for that year was very loved by him. He really loved his music, so James Dick later on invited Babajanyan to America, and the first time he was rejected. The second time he was able to bring him to Texas, and it took me 3 years to hunt him down, and I was finally able to find him and interview him about Babajanyan's music. And Babajanyan was, for example, an honorary citizen of Texas and as well as Ohio. So he went to Texas and he had a United States tour. So in terms of the future work that lays ahead of us, we're going to have a 105th anniversary of Babajanyan next year. So we're working right now on a French translation of the book. There will be an Armenian translation of the book as well. Also, a lot of people ask me about the audiobook, so hopefully that will also happen, because together with Babajanyan's music on the background, that can be something beautiful and also very accessible. Because the manner that I tried to write this book was both accessible and academical. I wanted to people from different walks of life to be able to understand Babajanyan. Therefore, you will see some of my memories, some of the memories of the performer, memories of my childhood, as well as Babajanyan's professional life and everything around it. And hopefully, we will have events that will be dedicated to the 105th anniversary, because unfortunately his 100th anniversary fell on post-COVID time. It was 2021, so people were not necessarily very ready for those types of events. And it is my enormous pleasure to be able to present this and to be able to work on this. This was truly my honor, because as my advisor at McGill would say, he'd say, Nay, you're a fan of Babajanyan, and I truly am a fan of Babajanyan, but it also took me quite some years to make sure that he is given the respect, that he is given the light and the highlight that he truly deserves, both as a composer and as a person. So thank you so much. If you have any questions, you're welcome to ask.
Hi, I'm a physicist, so in the 70s and 80s, the only people I could meet who knew anything about Soviet Union were Jews, and they all knew about Babajanyan's movie music. To them, he was the most popular movie music writer, and I keep on insisting that he was a classical music composer, so I understand what you're saying. Can you say what influence he had? You kept saying songs, but in fact, a lot of his commissions were for movies, and he was considered a first-rate movie, like Le Grand, or people like this, so perhaps you might want to comment on that.
And you may know that in 1977 he actually won the prize as the best composer of the world for his actual songwriting and for his music for the movies. And you're absolutely correct, he was commissioned oftentimes for music for the movies. But interestingly that you said about the influence, I was hoping somebody will ask, because he was extremely international as a person, very open-minded, which was not necessarily encouraged. And he would snuggle, some recordings that were not allowed in the state. And for example, one of the musical examples I wanted to show you is a piece that's celebrating Moscow's beauty, Лучший город земли, the best city in the world, which is written in the style of American twist. And even though we had a Khrushchev thaw, which was supposed to be a little bit more libertarian, when Khrushchev himself heard that song, he said, twist, an American genre about Moscow, take it off the rotation. And it was immediately taken off the rotation from the radio rotation, and later on returned after Khrushchev was no longer in power. So when it comes to influences, Babajanyan was extremely open-minded. He used the rumba rhythms, he used jazz idioms, he used national folk, even some African rhythms in his music. So he was extremely open-minded, and he always tried to include that in his music. I hope I responded to your question.
you very much for your work. It's actually wonderful, and we really enjoy it. So my question is, how is he viewed in today's Russia?
Oh, that's a good question. We always have a debate. I just started noticing that during the book launches we have a debate whether or not he was Soviet composer, or is he Soviet Armenian, or is he an Armenian composer. He is widely popular in Russia. I would say that maybe even more than in Armenia in terms of his, again, popular music, but even classical legacy, I would say that is oftentimes performed in Russia. And nowadays we still have the big gala concert dedicated to some anniversaries of Babajanyan, and we're struggling right now with Armenian government to actually have a Babajanyan museum in Yerevan, because a lot of people feel strongly that he deserves a museum to his name in Yerevan, but unfortunately it is with difficulties that we are encountering that idea as of right now. But in modern Russia, he is celebrated as the Soviet composer of wonderful songs of that time.
Thanks again for your work. What was your first exposure to his music? I mean, you grew up in Siberia, so I'm assuming you heard him there even?
That's a very good question. I start with that. My book actually starts with my first impression of Babajanyan. My sister was a pianist and she used to play his music. And one of my very early exposures, I was a little kid, I was around 6, I think, something like that, or even maybe less, was actually in Yerevan. It was not in Siberia, because we used to come to Armenia for the summer vacations, and that's why I remember, and I truly fell in love with his music, and it was the piece that's called Bagar Shapat Dance, the dance from Bagar Shapat, and it is truly virtuosic, beautiful work that my sister was playing on the piano, and that truly made a connection to me. I was completely enamored with the harmonies, with the tempo, with the rhythm, and I think that that's where the connection actually sparked. Very, very long time ago.
If I may, before I ask a question, tell that I am familiar with his art. I grew up with it. His music was all over the place, coming from the radio, TV, concerts, and I happened to meet him personally when I was young. And he, in Dijan, in the Hall of Composers, he was extremely down-to-earth, very positive, very friendly person, very nice person, who was being very much aware of his enormous talent, his connection with the people was outstanding.
That's true.
And also, I'd like to mention that there is some interviews that left, in particular with Vera Karnastaeva, which is professor of Russian Conservatory, Moscow Conservatory, where he explains how he writes music, that he tries to follow the rules of the melody or classical rules. And also, he was asked once by famous artist, Ahmet Jigarkhanyan, how do you write that music? How it comes to me? He says, I don't know. Ara Lasuna, he said, I hear it. And one question I want to ask, your interpretation of Kani Burjani or Elegia is absolutely outstanding. How did you choose this piece? And once again, who did the arrangement?
So the piece is available on, if you ever, put Elegy or Nune, like you will find the piece and you will see the name. His name is Andreasen. And I chose this piece because it was my lucky charm for a very long time. This piece he wrote when he actually encountered Khachaturian, because Khachaturian oftentimes would invite folk musicians to his house and he would get inspiration from them. And when he learned that Khachaturian passed away, he wrote the piece that was dedicated, it's in memory of Khachaturian. But the piece itself, the melody, is from the folk troubadour, Ashok Sayat-Nova. And for me, for years, and no matter what I would play, where I would play, before going on stage, I would listen to that song. I would listen to that piece, and it became almost like my lucky charm. And then I thought that I need to be able to play my lucky charm now. think we have maybe a question, like one more question. Time for one more question. If there is any.
Well, I have another question. Can you say what other Armenian composers influenced him, if any, like, Mansourian and all these
Mansourian
people?
came much later.
I know him. The question is, they're now digging back into the
Yes.
middle, even Armenian, Bedros Shujunian, I'm from Montreal too, by the way. All these people are digging up old Armenian music in
Yeah.
order to keep it alive. And so, was there such activity on Babazanyan's part?
So in the book as well, you will see a whole chapter dedicated to the Armenian composers that shaped Babazanyan, and a lot of that would be Ashok Jivani, it would be Sayat Nova, it would be of course Komitas Mardapet, that is, we can't avoid in our history, of course Khachaturian. We also, as I already mentioned, such composers as Rachmaninoff, who are not Armenian composers, but also Rachmaninoff, Bach, Babazanyan studied a lot of Bach as well. So when it came to Armenian composers, I would also say Alexander Spendiaryan, who is the founder of Armenian Opera House, as we know, an opera. So he was very much influenced by his early walks, to the opera and his exposure to the opera. And also his parents, they were actually playing folk instruments, they were very musically inclined. So they really instilled the love for folk music in Babazanyan. So I would say that this is the round of composers.
Please join me in